So the policies, first of all, monetary policy. So interest rates are at the low bound. Nothing can be done about those. So what has been done are various measures, in particular what's called quantitative easing or large-scale asset purchase programs. So Japan started them already several years ago, then Great Britain, the United States, and then last year ECB introduced these as well, though ECB used earlier various other special policies. But then the asset purchase program was introduced in just a little over a year ago. And here's a little more data on the asset purchase program. So Japan had a program already 15 years ago or so. And then this current new program with the current extensions, there was a 2010 with some extension, and then the latest one started 2014, and it's ongoing. Japan has spent a lot of resources on these asset purchases. So the balance sheet of the central bank grows if they start to buy bonds into their balance sheet, and their balance sheet is now 70% of gross domestic product. This is last year's summer figure, so it's actually higher this year. In the United States, the first these programs were 2008, 2010, 2011, and then the last one, 2014. Their balance sheet of the Fed is now about 25% of GDP. Great Britain had one program from 2009 to 2012, and the balance sheet is about 22% of GDP. ECB, as I said, had limited programs in terms of some purchases of bonds, but the new program was started in particular in 2005 with the government bonds and extended actually about a month ago, a little over a month ago. And not right now, a little bit while ago, the ECB balance sheet is about 25% of GDP. So that's where we are in terms of the basic data. So what about, how should we think about this, how can we get out of this? And in particular, does this asset purchase program work theoretically, and when does it work possibly? And so let me, rather than discuss the empirical results on that, I can comment if you want in the discussion about that a little bit. But let me just say that so the problem are these significant shocks that lead into dynamics that goes eventually to possibly to deflation. How to avoid that? Well, one possibility, of course, is something those who know economics several decades ago, I don't know if current young students know, but there was a literature after World War II, or during World War II, in particular about something called real balance effects and wealth effects. It started then with A.C. Pigou and Don Patinkin. They argued that these deflations will be self-correcting in the way because if price level starts to fall systematically, the real balances of consumers go up, and their real wealth will also go up, and that will increase consumption and so forth. Of course, with Ricardian consumers, there is no such mechanism in the simplest model that I've used here. I've explicitly assumed that these financial things don't matter for consumption. But that could happen, and yes, that is indeed one mechanism. So the paper I have with Jess Benabib and George Evans has that case covered relatively briefly, but that is the basic result, that the non-Ricardian consumers, if you have, there is convergence back to them. But it's a very, very sort of a wide-ranging and a very time-consuming dynamics in this setting. So that's one possibility. But if you don't rely on that, or if you say if consumers in fact are Ricardian, then we have no problem. Then we have no way to get back through the asset valuations here. So one possibility would be this asset purchase program, which, if we don't have financial market complications, is basically that the central bank doesn't use the interest rate rule any longer, but just goes and buys. It starts to expand the money supply by buying government bonds. So effectively it moves to a money supply rule, something like what Milton Friedman recommended a long time ago, and that we can look at that. And this is, we actually looked at this a little bit in an earlier paper, and then also under rational computation, this can work in these situations. But this has not been looked at. These are flexible price models, so I actually did a little bit of work and looked at what happens when prices are sticky. So there's a forthcoming, just about to appear, a paper which covers this case. And here's, in terms of the previous figure that I had, here's what happens. Here are some details. So injections of nominal money, we assume this money supply to be increasing at a constant rate, and the question is what happens? Here's the new thing to the previous figure, which is that we have a dashed curve here, this has been numerically calculated, and it has the following property. Let me just say it in words, that if the economy is any point to the right of this curve, then switching at that moment to that money supply rule will make the economy converge to the targeted equilibrium. Notice, it's a fairly large region. It covers the conventional stuff. It also covers some of the extreme. But in particular, if we look at more closely here, if you're at that low point, or even slightly to the left of it, or left and down to it, it can help. But if you're too far down and left, it doesn't help. I mean, these are specific numbers, so obviously the curve will shift if I use different numerical values. But that's the message, that if you've been going low down for long enough, then this switch to money supply rule, by starting to buy government bonds, will not help. You will not converge back to the. But if you do it early enough, yes, it does help. That's the answer for that. There are other possibilities one could try as well. One could try something what's called a price level targeting. In those who know monetary economics and monetary policy a great deal, this is a proposal which has almost hardly ever been implemented. There are two instances in Sweden when they actually formally introduced price level targeting. And they were both Knut Wicksell, one of the great monetary economists in time. When he was younger, he proposed it to the Swedish central bank, and it had disastrous result because he put the initial price. The question is where you are in this price level targeting regime. Depends on very much what you tell about how the starting point is relative to the target path. And he made the mistake to put it very high, which led to a big recession, and then it was abandoned the policy rule regime very quickly. Then the second time, when was it? I think it's end of the 1920s or early 30s. I can't remember the year. Maybe early 30s. This was tried again. Wicksell had just died, but somebody proposed it, and now they were careful with the initial. They got off the gold standard. And they were changing the monetary policy, and they switched to price level targeting with a relatively low initial condition for the price level, the target price level, the actual price level to use in this calculation, and then it worked well. It worked well for a few years, but they did abandon it later on. So, and I've actually looked at it in some work with one of my collaborators, Kaushik Mitra, at these questions, and when does it work? And it may work very well, especially if this regime is very well trusted. It's basically forward guidance is make sure that it works, that it is a fully credible regime. It will not be abandoned, and then it turns out that it works pretty well. If there is no trust about the system, so it's not fully credible, then it doesn't work very well. So credibility is an issue, but